Okay, the election of 1880. The Republicans in 1880 obviously still kind of running the show ever since the end of the Civil War. I mean, you've got Grant winning in 68, Grant winning in 72, and then Rutherford B. Hayes winning in 76. And then in the election of 1880, you had James Garfield, who not a lot of people knew about, and he had a vice presidential candidate named Chester Arthur, who we'll talk about soon here in a little bit more depth. Although, I'll just say this, that Chester Arthur was in a high political position because of the spoil system. The spoil system was in place for a long time. Chester Arthur, just to be blunt, wasn't the sharpest guy out there, but he had risen to a position that he never thought he'd be able to get to, and that's vice president of the United States, because he's a really nice guy and he very helpful, and he had risen in the ranks. And it's going to be a tough deal when he becomes president after the death of Garfield. The Democrats nominated Winfield Scott Hancock, and James Garfield is going to win this election. As you can see here, he's getting a lot of support up in the north. You can see blue states up there, and then in the south, the Democrats, Hancock, he's winning in the deep south. No matter what, the Democrats now are the whites are beginning to vote again, and they're always going to vote Democrat no matter what. It's called Solid South. A Republican doesn't win a southern state until 1920. So that just goes to show you politically what's gone on there for a really long time. So James Garfield ends up winning this election, and he was assassinated. He became the second president in American history after Lincoln to be assassinated. He was shot by a man by the name of Charles Guiteau, who was upset because he felt that he deserved a high political position through the spoil system. He felt that he worked hard to get Garfield elected and therefore should have had a job. He didn't get a job, so he shot, and eventually Garfield dies from the wound. And you really can't deny the irony of this whole thing, because who's thrust into the limelight but the vice president of the United States, Chester Arthur, who had gained his position as vice president because of the spoil system. So now you got a guy, president, who taken over for someone who's shot by someone who felt they should be better treated through the spoil system, and then this guy takes over. So everybody said, okay, it's going to be the same old, because of this is how this guy got to that point. But Chester Arthur surprised a lot of people by signing a bill called the Pendleton Act, which set up a civil service commission to review hiring practices, basically making the spoil system obsolete. No longer could a president come in and fire a bunch of people and put friends in high government positions. You had to pass a competitive exam. They would rank order you, and then you'd be hired or not. So the Civil Service Commission was created, and they would review these practices. So the Pendleton Act, although not on the books today, we still have a system where government jobs, like working for the IRS, you have to pass a test, and you get rank ordered. And when a new president comes in, they don't just fire everyone. So big difference. That really, there wasn't much else that Chester Arthur did in his presidency, but that was big right there. Okay, so let's talk about 4 years down the road. Chester Arthur is not renominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party runs a guy by the name of James Blaine, and a lot of people didn't like James Blaine. It was the Republican Party was beginning to split, much like the Republican Party is split today in 2021. They were very split. They're split at this time too. So just kind of the way things were going politically at that time. Sorry. The Democrats nominated Grover Cleveland, and for the first time, they have a real shot at winning the presidency because of how controversial James Blaine was. And here's the thing, socially, is that Grover Cleveland had a child out of wedlock. And even though that would be somewhat of a issue today, but it was really a big issue in 1884. Different guy, Grover Cleveland. He had a baby out of wedlock. He ended up marrying somebody like 35 years younger than him while he was president of the United States. Just a different guy, interesting guy to study. And it looked, for all intents and purposes, like the reign of the Republican Party was going to continue until this guy, a guy who worked for Blaine, called the Irish names. Basically said, we'll just talked about them as rum, Romanism, and rebellion in regard to the Irish. Rum being they drank a lot, Romanism being they were Catholic, and rebellion meaning they were rebels and caused trouble. So it was something that the Irish didn't like, and because of it, they threw their vote to Grover Cleveland. And there were so many Irish in New York that the narrow victory by Cleveland in New York was because of the Irish vote. And it comes back to this guy right here coming and criticizing the Irish. Blaine would have won. And Blaine could have come out and said, I don't believe in that, but he didn't. Had he come out and said that, he probably would have won the election. Grover Cleveland is going to pull off a shocker. Grover Cleveland will be the first Democrat president since Buchanan in 1856. So it's a long layoff for the Democrat Party. Here was a malicious cartoon before the election. A baby, this is the woman supposedly, and this is the baby out of wedlock. A little bit about Grover Cleveland. Again, first Democrat president since Buchanan. He was a supporter of what's called laissez-faire, hands-off, which is very, most of the time Republicans are hands-off government on big business. We'll discuss that a little bit more in class. And at the time, the Treasury had a surplus of $145 million. We don't even know what a surplus is today. We always are in a deficit. We have a huge deficit. But back then, the government was taking in more money in the form of taxes than they were spending. And most of it was due to this high tariff. So in 1887, Cleveland talked about lowering the protective tariff. And one group that didn't like talking about lowering the protective tariff was business owners. Because if you lower the tariff, that means foreign goods are going to be cheaper and people would start buying foreign goods instead of American made goods. So business people didn't like it. So he is going to really upset big business, and they're going to flip their support in 1888. So in the election of 1888, now big business sides with Republican Benjamin Harrison because he wasn't going to touch the tariff, whereas Grover Cleveland talked about lowering the protective tariff. So yeah, that was big. That the big business. This is the Gilded Age, so the rise of big business is huge. So in this election, Grover Cleveland is going to lose to Benjamin Harris because of the loss of big business, and also Grover Cleveland is going to have way more votes than Benjamin Harrison. We've seen this before. We saw that. For instance, Hillary Clinton had more votes than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump won the election in 2016. It's happened numerous times, but here's a classic example where Grover Cleveland had like 300,000 more votes, but Benjamin Harrison is going to win this election because big business sided with him. So there's the outcome right there. And here's a political cartoon. Here it says, the title is Coming Out for Harrison. So these are factory workers. They're going to vote. And you see there the men in black suits here with a whip. And the whip, it says coercion. And it says here, he's handing them what's called a discharge slip, which is you're fired. Basically, they're telling them to vote for Harrison. And if they don't vote for Harrison, they would be fired. This went on everywhere. A lot of different places like Ohio and New York, big important states. Because of the influence of big business now, they were able to gain a victory for Harrison. And here's the map that shows that. Winning of New York, winning Ohio, When Harrison won those states, it was big. New York and Ohio were big in giving the victory to the guy who had actually less votes than, but it doesn't matter. It's all about the electoral college, as we know. So Benjamin Harrison, you know, you've got 4 years of what the Democrats were in for 4 years, and now they're out. So you get Republicans regain the White House. And one of the first things that he wants to do, Benjamin Harrison, in order to thank the big business, is he's going to try to jack up the tariff as high as he possibly can, because Republicans at this point now want to jack up the tariff. They're beginning to see the power of big business and how they can win them elections. Theodore Roosevelt's introduction into history for us. He was named the head of the Civil Service Commission for hiring practices. And they were given, Benjamin Harrison was trying to give out as much of the surplus as he possibly could, but he wanted to give them to people who would vote Republican. So he gave huge amounts of money to former Civil War vets who he knew were going to vote for him. And the purpose for giving away all this money, so you can say, look, we don't have any money in the Treasury. We need to jack up tariffs as high as we can. And then the big business would side with them. There's some of the members of his cabinet right there. Secretary of State James Blaine, we talked about him. He ran for president, and then Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, let's talk about the big important topic during this time, not the most exciting thing to talk about, the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act. As we talked about earlier in this chapter, the drive to create inflation through the coinage of silver. Free and unlimited coins of silver is what farmers talked about. How can you get out of debt? Let's create inflation. The price of wheat will go up. The price of cotton will go up, and farmers will make more money. But big business hated that. So you got two competing factions here. Farmers want inflation. Business owners don't. Farmers want free and unlimited coins of silver to create inflation. Business owners do not. Big business does not. So there's a compromise, but it's pretty underhanded. The Sherman-Silver Purchase Act and the McKinley Tariff Bill were linked together. The two were linked. So let's talk about the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act. It basically doubled Bland Allison, allowed the Treasury to buy 4.5 million ounces of silver per month and coin it. And the thing that the way they sabotaged it is they said, yeah, you could turn your silver in for gold if you want to. Basically, a silver dollar had 50 cents worth of silver in it. You could turn that in for gold if you wanted to. So you're basically doubling your money. The equivalent of me giving you telling me, give me 2 quarters, and you give me back $1. I give you 2 quarters, you give me $1. I'll continue to do that. I'm doubling my money. So if you turned in your silver, you can get gold and it would double your money. So Sherman-Silver Purchase Act. Okay, so then they linked it together with the McKinley Tariff Bill to get it passed. Now, farmers hated a high protective tariff because they had to pay double for tools, and it just wasn't, they didn't support it at all. So the McKinley Tariff Bill, though, obviously big business wanted it, so Americans would buy more American products and not foreign products. So this McKinley Tariff Bill boosted the tariff up 48.4%. So it was a compromise. So the two bills got passed together. They were linked and passed together. So if you get the McKinley Tariff Bill passed, you also get the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act passed. Farmers got what they wanted in the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, and the big business got what they wanted, a really high tariff. But here's what happened and why it was sabotaged and why it was kind of dirty. Is when they passed this thing, they knew by putting in there that you could turn your silver in for gold, everybody was going to do that. Why wouldn't you give someone 2 quarters for $1 back? And that's what they were doing. They were turning in their silver dollars and they were getting gold and they were doubling their money. Well, what happened was it started to drain the Treasury of gold. And if the Treasury gets drained of gold at the time, because we were on a gold standard, you couldn't print out more money. So it would fight any kind of inflation that would happen. So the McKinley Tariff Bill stayed. The Sherman-Silver Purchase Act did not stay. So farmers got hammered and big business got what they wanted, which always seems to be the case. The McKinley tariff bill stayed. Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed. So that's how that was pretty underhanded. Okay, so the election of 1892, talk about that. It's a rematch of 4 years before, 1888. The Republicans nominated Benjamin Harrison, the Democrats Grover Cleveland, and then the emergence of a third party known as the Populist Party, which surprisingly won over a million votes and a million popular votes and 22 electoral votes. But Grover Cleveland is vindicated. He comes back and wins, becoming the only president in American history to win 2 non-consecutive terms. He was in for 4, and then he was out, defeated, and then he came back and ran and was 4 more years as president. But the rise of the Populist Party showed you where American mindset was, at least farmers. Farmers finally had a party that they could rely on, someone that would represent them. So that's major in the world of farming. So it went from, as you could see the flow chart here, from at first Granges, and then after that Farmers Alliances, and then more formally the Populist Party. So their farmers are being heard at least somewhat. Here's the Populist platform. These are some of the things that they promoted the most. Number 1 would be free and unlimited coins of silver. In their world, they wanted to create inflation, and the best way they felt that they could do that was through free and unlimited coins of silver. It's already gone from the Bland Allison to the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and now they want even more. They're not satisfied with that. They want a graduated income tax so that the more you make, the more you pay. So they wanted rich people to pay more. They wanted government ownership of telephone, telegraph, and railroads because they felt that they were being what they called railroaded. They felt that they were being overcharged, so they wanted the government to control that. They want direct election of senators, to actually be able to vote for senators. We have that now, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute here, but they wanted 1-term limit for president. They wanted to be able to vote someone out if they didn't like them. They wanted initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative is getting enough signatures that on a potential law. Referendum would mean if you had enough signatures, you put it on the ballot. Recall would be getting rid of elected officials. And currently in California, there's a push to recall Gavin Newsom. 7 would be shorter workday for industrial workers. They're trying to get factory workers on their side so they're not just a farmers party. And the last thing would be immigration restrictions that would prevent immigrants from lowering wages. And again, another stipulation there that would get factory workers on their side so they're not just a farmers party. But all these, these things here, 1 through 8, in some way, shape, or form will eventually be enacted. Maybe not as quickly as the populists wanted, and during their time, it's not going to happen, but it will down the road in a period called the Progressive Era. We're going to get limited on coins of silver, not unlimited. There is going to be a graduated income tax. We pay it now. In April, we're about to, pay taxes. Government ownership of telephone, telegraph, and railroads. We've had government control in some of these areas, not necessarily ownership. That would be more socialistic. Direct election of senators. We had an amendment to pass, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, that allows people to vote for senators. And 1-term limit for president. At this time, we had no term limits for president. Now we have a 2-term limit, maybe not 1 term, but 2. We do have initiative, referendum, and recall. We do have laws that prevent overworking of workers, and then we did have immigration restrictions. So in some way, shape, or form, almost every one of these was passed, just not at the time of the populists. So they're bringing up some really good points that will eventually be enacted. So this is a political cartoon here about the Populist Party promoted it, and it will lead to controlling the rates of railroads, basically saying that. a couple other political cartoons, the People's Party. Sometimes the Populist Party was known as the People's Party, but it had a whole bunch of different alliances, right? And they call it the Party of Lunacy, kind of is you know, it had way too many factions. And then here the political cartoon shows the populists eating up the Democrat Party, meaning taking votes away from them and hurting them in elections. You know, the Democrat Party possibly could have won. In future, there'll be elections that the populists take votes away from the Democrats. The populist party problems came down to race issues. At first, they allowed African Americans to be members of the Populist Party, and then they turned their back on African Americans later on. And then, you know, so many of the farmers and sharecroppers there were so many of them in the South that when they left the party, the numbers went way down. So really what brought down the Populist Party was race issues. Okay, as I've talked about before, the Gilded Age was just strife with strikes, many different strikes that we'll be talking about. Here's one of them right here, the Homestead Steel Strike. It's a plant in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. This strike by the people of the steel mill resulted in violence that killed 10 and wounded 60. The Pinkerton detectives were called in by the United States government. The Pinkerton detectives were like a strike-breaking organization that the government would use. And again, a lot of people, common man was frustrated by this because already we've had Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the first president to call in the troops on the striking workers in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And now it's happened again when Grover Cleveland sent in the Pinkerton detectives on the striking workers, resulting in death. They came down a barge down the Monongahela River, just armed to the teeth. They were just heavily armed and opened fire on these strikers. It was an ugly scene. It was a bad look for government to always be siding with the rich owners of business. It says here, the Pinkerton Detectives Agency often supplied men to break strikes. In 1892, the Amalgamated Iron and Steel Workers Union called out its members at the Homestead plant owned by Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick. The men were brought in on armed barges down the Monongahela River. The strikers were waiting for them, and a day-long battle took place. 7 Pinkerton agents and 9 workers were killed, and created a great deal of bad publicity for the agency and for the United States government. So in Cleveland's second term, a lot of bad things happened that put him on, you know, that the people to not support and not like him. For one, there was a depression that hit in 1893, and people were losing their jobs and businesses were going under. Again, too many railroad lines were built. It's very similar to the strike that occurred in 1870, the recession and eventually depression and panic that hit in 1873, 20 years before. The other thing that happened in his second term was that the gold drain that we discussed, because people were turning in their silver for gold was being drained out of the treasury, and it was a panic time. If at that point, what Cleveland did is he asked J.P. Morgan, right, one of the richest men in America, to borrow $65 million in gold so he could shore up the treasury. Now, it's somewhat worked, but the look of it, the optics, where government was, you know, getting money and have from big business, it just looked like government and big business had an arrangement. You know, this marriage of the two just wasn't healthy, and the common man did not like it. Also, Cleveland repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which upset farmers, you know, and that they didn't like that because they were excited as heck because they could turn in their silver for gold. And then he repealed it. It actually had to be repealed, or it could have been even more disastrous. But you can imagine how upset farmers were that they could no longer take advantage of this loophole. And then later on, in the next chapter, we'll be discussing how Cleveland also sent the troops in on the strikers at Pullman. He did it at the Homestead Steel Strike, and he's going to do it again at Pullman. Again, he's not on the right side of the common man. Common man does not like what he's doing at all. So he's very unpopular. Just an example of how desperate people were at the time. 1894, Jacob Coxey, a guy from Ohio, formed what's called the Commonwealth Army, and he marched to Washington, D.C. because there were so many poor people that didn't have any money and didn't have jobs, and the Depression of 1893 was hitting hard. They were trying to get the government to create jobs. Coxey demanded the government relieve unemployment with an inflationary public works program, right, where the government would have these jobs and then hire people to do the work. It's something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt would use in the next huge depression that's going to hit in the 1930s. The government is going to create jobs. They didn't do it yet here with this, but Jacob Coxey is calling for it. So he's way ahead of his time. But again, why does the book mention this? Because it shows you the mindset of the people and how upset they are and how desperate they are to march all the way to DC, camp out on the lawn, get themselves in trouble. Many of them arrested because they want the government to do something. So a lot of frustration. And that's the end of chapter 23.